Uh, Tonight's speaker is Sophie Osborn. She's going to be joining us from Montana. And I told her that there were probably going to be some people here in shorts, so please stand up because we're so as even I was going to wear shorts tonight. Anyway, tonight's program is Feather Trails, a journey of discovery among endangered species. And she's going to share with us her personal experiences reintroducing endangered peregrine falcons, Hawaiian Crows, California Condors to the wild. And her book that she wrote will immerse the readers into the triumphs and tribulations of being a wildlife biologist. Sophie will explore the threats that imperil these birds and reveals what's harmed them and threatens us too. Sophie is an award-winning environmental writer and wildlife biologist whose work has included a study and conservation of more than a dozen bird species in the Americas. She contributed to reintroduction efforts of several endangered species and served as field manager for the California Condor Recovery Program in Arizona for 4 years. Her first book, Condors in Canyon Country, won the 2007 National Outdoor Book Award, Nature and the Environment. Reviewers for the American Birding Association chose her second book, Feather Trails, as their favorite book of 2024. And Sophie has also written articles for Birdwatching, Wyoming Wildlife, and Sojourns magazine. Her writings are also available on her website and her Words for Birds Substack blog. So let's welcome Sophie.
Hey, let me share my screen.
Sophie, there she is.
Good, I'm right by the speaker. I'll be able to
Okay, can everyone hear me and can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Terrific. Good evening, and a big thanks to all of you for tuning in to hear about conserving endangered birds. I definitely wasn't bored. It's always fun to see how chapters operate, and your chapter is doing amazing things. I'm thrilled to have this opportunity tonight to speak to Texas bird lovers. This is my first Texas talk, especially since Texas is such a critically important state for so many of our birds. My book, Feather Trails, A Journey of Discovery Among Endangered Birds, describes my journey into the amazing world of birds. The book is in part a personal story about being or becoming and being a wildlife biologist. It takes you behind the screen. Wait a minute. I have this menu bar that's not going down, but hopefully that's not interrupting you guys. The book takes you behind the scenes and shows you what it's like day to day to reintroduce captive raised birds to the wild in order to save 3 endangered species, the Peregrine Falcon, the Hawaiian Crow, and the California Condor. And in the process, the book illuminates the threats that imperiled these and other birds. In the early 1900s, miners began taking canaries into the coal mine because the birds were highly sensitive to carbon monoxide and would keel over if the air started to become unsafe. Today, our wild birds...
Sophie.
Yep.
Your slideshow hasn't started yet.
Seriously? Okay, I'm very sorry. This is where I was telling you that the book takes you behind the scenes and shows you what it's like to reintroduce these 3 species. And in the process, the book illuminates the threats that imperiled these birds and other birds. And then this is where I was saying that today our wild birds are the canaries in the coal mine that alert us to environmental harms through their declining populations or their failure to thrive. So are we back on track and can everyone see?
Yes.
Okay, I'm very sorry about the glitch. I don't know what happened. Because birds are so visible and vocal, it's relatively easy for us to monitor them and determine if they're doing well or declining. And we've learned over time that what harms birds often harms us too, which is a central theme of this book. The peregrine falcon is a top-level predator that feeds mainly on birds, and it is found in a variety of open habitats on every continent except Antarctica. Peregrines are typically found where they're suitable nest sites, which consist of high ledges on cliffs, buildings, and structures like bridges. Today, peregrines are relatively widespread, but years ago, back in the 1950s, peregrines began to disappear at an alarming rate. Their disappearance was first confirmed by a British biologist known as Derek Ratcliffe, who completed peregrine surveys in England in 1962. He found abandoned peregrine territories and broken eggs in peregrine nests, and he realized that the birds weren't successfully raising young. After hearing about the dramatic declines of peregrines in Britain, a US biologist named Joe Hickey, who had been a student of Aldo Leopold's and who wrote the first ever guide to birdwatching, which I thought might be of interest to many of you, he launched a peregrine survey in the eastern US in 1964. During that summer, biologists surveyed virtually every known peregrine territory east of the Mississippi River, from Alabama up to Nova Scotia. And they didn't find a single peregrine. The eastern peregrine had completely disappeared. A follow-up conference in Madison, Wisconsin in 1965 brought together scientists, falconers, and naturalists from around the world. Peregrine declines were reported from 36 countries on 5 continents, and biologists were soon calling the collapse of peregrine populations an ecological disaster. At the conference, British scientists presented preliminary evidence that pesticides might be contributing to peregrine declines. A new pesticide known as DDT had been used very successfully in World War II to control insect-borne diseases, and it had come into widespread use after the war to combat insect pests. Peregrines in Britain had disappeared from areas where DDT and other pesticides were being used. This information inspired many of the Madison conference attendees to go on to study the effects of pesticides on peregrines. Other attendees, including Tom Cade, who worked at Cornell University, were eager to see if they could breed peregrines in captivity, which was something that had never been done before at the time. If they succeeded, they would release peregrines to the wild in areas where pesticide use was less prevalent. Captive breeding was eventually successful, and reintroductions began in the eastern US in 1974. When I headed to Wyoming in 1991 for my first field work as a biologist, releasing captive bred peregrines to the wild, the falcon had been reintroduced successfully to the east, and reintroductions were ramping up in the west. I'd only camped a few times when my field partner and I found ourselves living out of a tent in grizzly bear country in northwest Wyoming. We spent our first week looking after 5 captive reared falcon nestlings that we'd placed into a large box known as a hack box that was anchored to some cliffs at our release site. Each falcon wore a differently colored leg band so that we could identify them. And being a budding young scientist, I wanted to be objective and name them after their band colors. But my field partner overruled me and named them after Egyptian gods and mythological figures. So you'll know where the names came from when I read a passage in a moment. On release day, our supervisor removed the front of the box so that the birds could fly free. And in these types of reintroductions, the first 24 hours post-release are critical, and a lot can go wrong. For example, a peregrine in Washington state flew out of the box, got carried aloft on a thermal, a rising column of air, and was never seen again. We also had to worry about predators like golden eagles and great horned owls, and even adult peregrines that could attack the young birds as they were taking their first flights. After leaving the box, our peregrines all stayed nearby initially, but during an afternoon thunderstorm, a side door on the hack box blew shut with a bang and flushed the birds. They scattered into a violent wind and disappeared. All but one eventually made it back to the vicinity of the hack box, but you'll have to, by that first night, but you'll have to read the book to see if our missing peregrine returned. I have to leave you with at least one teaser. Over the next 6 weeks, my field partner and I monitored the birds from dawn to dusk, put food out for them each day, and hazed away potential predators with noisemakers. The greatest joy of the whole summer was watching these young peregrines learn to fly. We documented their first hesitant flights and their wobbly landings. And we watched them as they mastered their wings and learned how to use the wind. So I'll just read a 2-page excerpt of Feather Trails that shows what it was like to watch these birds. This is the longest passage I'll read. It's 4 minutes long. So hopefully I won't put you to sleep after your dinners. Most entertaining for us, our peregrines began fine-tuning their flight skills and developing their nascent predatory tendencies with endless pursuits and mock battles. Just as playing kittens developed the agility and strength to catch fleet and elusive prey, so too did the falcons' tireless aerial games fine-tune their bodies to respond to the evasive flights of the shorebirds, songbirds, and waterfowl that evolved over the eons to dodge the speed-made predators that hunted them. Though the wild chases had a playful air, these flights, this practice, would determine whether our peregrines became successful hunters and survivors or whether they went hungry and perished. Evenings and mornings were now filled with the falcon's screams and aerial exploits as one bird streamed after another like a small fighter plane locked onto a fast-moving target. The pursued bird dodged and rolled, tucked its wings, and fell earthward in ever more sophisticated evasive maneuvers. Becoming one with the sky, the peregrines flew with ineffable grace, dazzling speed, and breathtaking agility. As I watched their transcendent flights, I felt my own heart quicken. Transported by the falcon's inimitable aerial prowess, I could almost feel the wind stream behind me, feel every subtle movement of wing or tail that determined my trajectory, my speed, my effortless engagement with the wind. All the while, earthbound, I dispassionately scribbled my field notes, recording our falcon's flights while never taking my eyes off the birds as they traced invisible loops across the firmament, imprinting their movements, their exuberance, their vitality forever in my mind's eye, and lifting my spirits in ways that only such epiphanic sights in nature can. Small wonder that legendary raptor expert Leslie Brown called the unmatched and unmatchable peregrine the prince of all flying birds. Now Ra launched from the cliff top and with strong wing beats chased after Isis, who had glided over him, trailing an invisible weight that seemed to pull the young male into motion. Climbing above her, he screamed a challenge, then drew in his wings and dropped toward her at a steep angle. Cacking in protest, Isis tucked a wing, fell away sideways, and rolled over, presenting her ferocious talons. Undaunted, Ra extended his legs and grabbed Isis's talons in his own. Briefly, the two cartwheeled through the sky, their screams echoing off the cliffs and ricocheting over the valley. Seconds later, they released each other, and Isis circled over the cliff before extending her wings, flaring her tail, and landing with an almost imperceptible wobble. And then another tiercel, that's a young male, materialized out of the clouds, and the pursuer became the pursued. Drawing his wings close to his body, Osiris dropped toward Ra with breathtaking speed and an agility that the larger-bodied, proportionately shorter-winged Isis could never match. Undaunted, Ra dropped to his side, cacking fiercely as Osiris shot harmlessly past him. Leveling out, Ra flapped his wings, found an updraft, and shot skyward. Circling briefly, he dived at Osiris, and the two sped like nanojets out of view behind the cliffs. Ever watchful and attuned to the world around him, Gawain tilted his head to the right then left, keeping a close eye on Ra and Osiris's antics from the cliff top as Isis preened assiduously beside him. His large eyes seemed to take in the entirety of the heavens, and he watched his fellow tiercels long after I had lost them from view. Although the open skies were now a significant component of our falcon's world, our view of the birds was all too often blocked by cliffs, rocks, trees, and hills. But even when I could no longer see our falcons, the trails they had blazed across the sky still lingered in my mind, and the peregrine's surreal speed and arresting acrobatics, even at this young age, left me awed. Our summer had plenty of drama, including one of our birds being attacked by a golden eagle. But about 5 weeks after their release, the falcons began to disperse as they learned to hunt for themselves. After they reached independence, they spent several months fine-tuning their hunting skills before embarking on their first migration. About half of juvenile peregrines survive their first year. Some falcons are killed by predators, others die in collisions with buildings, cars, or power lines, and some die in storms or are lost at sea. I could only hope that my young peregrines were successful since I never learned their fates. But my time working with them was a life transforming experience that inspired me to dedicate my career to helping birds. Over time, peregrine reintroductions like mine, which occurred all over North America, were wildly successful. Nearly 7,000 peregrines were reintroduced to the wild in the US and Canada. But what really allowed the peregrine falcon to recover was the banning of DDT in 1972. As a top predator, peregrines killed birds that had fed on foods that were contaminated with DDT. And by consuming lots of these birds over time, peregrines accumulated large amounts of the pesticide in their bodies, and this affected their calcium production, which led to them laying thin-shelled eggs. Fish-eating birds like bald eagles, ospreys, and brown pelicans were similarly impacted. All of these birds inadvertently crushed their eggs while trying to incubate them, so they couldn't raise any young and their population numbers crashed. It took many years of dying birds, scientific studies, environmental advocacy, the first ever environmental lawsuits, and several high-profile public hearings before DDT was finally banned. But rather than learn from the lessons that peregrines and other birds taught us, today we're experiencing a similar type of environmental catastrophe with a new class of pesticides known as neonicotinoids, or neonics for short. Neonics are less acutely toxic to vertebrates like birds than DDT was, but they're far, far more toxic to insects, and their widespread use has contributed to what many are calling an insect apocalypse. We're currently experiencing an ecologically catastrophic disappearance of our insects. Neonics are known as systemic insecticides because they're absorbed by a plant's roots and leaves, making the entire plant toxic to insects that feed on any part of it, including its fruits and flowers. Neonics are soluble in water, so they're transported by runoff from terrestrial to aquatic environments where they can contaminate surface and groundwater. These pesticides are widely used in agriculture. Seeds of more than 140 crops are coated in neonicotinoids before being planted. And although neonics are less toxic to birds than some of the pesticides that preceded them, a single corn seed coated with imidacloprid, which is one of the oldest and most widely used of the neonics, can kill a bird the size of a blue jay. Consuming lesser amounts can disrupt a songbird's ability to reproduce, so they're still very harmful to birds. More than anything, though, it's the disappearance of insects on which so many birds feed that's the biggest cause for alarm. Neonics are toxic to the organisms in our soils, to the aquatic invertebrates that feed our fish, to the bees and butterflies that pollinate our plants, and to the insects that sustain our birds and bats. So despite the dramatic lessons of the DDT era, where once again overusing a class of persistent pesticides whose impacts are widespread but still poorly understood, there's still no federal regulations limiting the use of neonics in the US, but fortunately a growing number of cities and a dozen or so states are starting to curtail or even ban their use. But to return to peregrines, the species recovered really well after DDT was banned, although I have to say that there's recent concern that the falcons are being hard hit by the avian flu. That said, though, the fastest animal in the world, the peregrine falcon, was removed from the U.S. endangered species list in 1999, and there are now about 3,000 peregrine falcon pairs in North America. So this has been a real conservation success story. Unfortunately, things haven't gone as well for the second species I write about, the Hawaiian crow, or alala, as it's also known in Hawaii. Many people are astonished to hear that any crow anywhere is critically endangered. Most of us know crows to be very opportunistic and well able to cope with people and their landscape changes. But crows that live on islands, and especially those that depend on forested habitats, are some of our most endangered birds. The Hawaiian crow is the most endangered corvid in the world. Corvids, as most of you probably know, are members of the crow, raven, and jay family. Despite its name, the Hawaiian crow is more closely related to the common raven than to our American crow. Historically, it occurred only on the island of Hawaii, also known as the Big Island, where it resided in the cloud forest. Much of the alala's forest habitat in Hawaii was destroyed first by Polynesian and then by European colonizers and the animals that they brought with them. Hawaiian birds had evolved on islands that had no land mammals. Their only native predator was the Hawaiian hawk, or Io. But people introduced rats and mongooses and domestic cats, all of which prey on Hawaiian birds that never evolved to cope with these types of predators. The rats readily climb trees and can consume bird eggs and nestlings. And Hawaiian crow nestlings that survived and left the nest successfully typically spent several weeks on the ground before they could fly. And this strategy worked well in when there were no ground predators, but in a world where there were cats and mongooses, the fledglings were acutely vulnerable to being killed. Outdoor cats pose an additional threat because they carry and transmit diseases. Toxoplasmosis is a cat-transmitted disease that's dangerous to wildlife and to people. The parasite that causes this disease reproduces in feline intestines. It's excreted in cat feces in the form of oocysts, which are single egg-like cells, and it's eventually ingested by an intermediate host, like a rat or a person. The parasite ultimately impacts the host's brain. So infected rats actually lose their fear of cats. They're even attracted to cat urine. Not surprisingly, they become easy prey, and that restarts the parasite's ingenious life cycle. Oocysts that aren't ingested can remain in the environment for a really long time. Because of runoff, they can contaminate aquatic as well as terrestrial environments. Worldwide, toxoplasmosis is one of the most common human parasitic infections. People can become infected by eating contaminated vegetables or undercooked meat, by cleaning out their cat's litter box if they have an outdoor cat, or even by weeding a garden that's visited by cats. Growing evidence suggests that the disease may be associated with a variety of mental disorders, including depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. It's also harmed wildlife, killing several alala and more than a dozen critically endangered Hawaiian monk seals. Hawaii's birds have also been decimated by avian malaria and avian pox, two diseases transmitted by introduced mosquitoes. These diseases are the major reason why Hawaii, sadly, is now known as the extinction capital of the world. Many of its native birds, including some of its renowned endemic honey creepers, a few of which I've pictured on this slide, will die of malaria after a single mosquito bite. Most of the native birds that are left in Hawaii now live at higher elevations where it's cooler, and so there are fewer mosquitoes. But in our warming climate, mosquitoes can thrive at higher and higher elevations, and soon there's going to be no mosquito-free habitat left for Hawaii's birds. As birds have shown us, introduced organisms threaten native wildlife, habitats, and humanity. Think diseases like West Nile virus. They degrade biodiversity, cause extinctions, and globally cost us about $423 billion a year. When I worked on the alala recovery project in the 1990s, there were only 12 wild alala left. My job was to look after the first 5 crows to be reintroduced to the wild. These crows were raised in captivity. and then transferred to the release site and placed in a hack box, which was this wooden portion of this facility here. So they were released into the hack box and were there for several weeks before being released first into the attached aviary and then later into the wild. I started my work in Hawaii about a week after their release to the wild. And this was my first impression upon arriving at the release site. A minute later, we pulled off the road into a clearing that held an aviary so immense, so spectacular that I simply stared at it, wondering at the work that went into enclosing full-size trees in a fortress that was as impenetrable to outsiders as it had been accommodating to its prior occupants. We stepped out of the vehicle onto the wet grass. And then through the mist came a strangely euphonic medley of throaty, echoing screams, intermixed with rumbled growls and haunting, evocative wails. I felt my neck prickle. The eerie, commanding sounds seemed to drift out of the floating fog, seemed to embody the lost voices of the trees, the ferns, the vines, released at last from their cellulose prisons. I was hearing the most prominent and unforgettable voice of the Hawaiian cloud forest, that of the ala-la, as the Hawaiians dubbed their singular crow. The bird's native name means cry like a child, but the crow's varied, penetrating, ventriloquistic vocalizations could only come from a child of an otherworldly forest, a creature of a more primal time and place. I stood transfixed, irrevocably moved by the strange but captivating sounds, which washed over me like a turbulent wind that spoke of an uncertain future, yet felt full of promise. And I thought, 12. Aside from the young reintroduced Hawaiian crows that I was hearing and was about to meet for the first time, only 12 ala-la remained in the wild. 12 birds to fill these forests with their astonishingly distinctive vocal repertoires. 12 birds to embody the lost world that lingered in this enigmatic place. 12 birds to carry this unique and intriguing species into the future. For a moment I felt the full weight and the privilege of the task on which I was about to embark. I was tasked with tracking the crows through the cloud forest, monitoring their behavior, and providing them with supplemental food until they could feed on their own. Ala-la eat a wide variety of forest fruits, and they're incredibly important seed dispersers on the island. They also feed on insects, and they probe flowers for nectar. The ala-la were remarkable. In addition to being very vocal, they were funny, playful, and just incredibly engaging. They're also really intelligent. They're one of the few birds that can use tools to extract food. The crows often foraged by hanging at the tips of branches, the way they're doing in this photograph, and they sometimes engaged in entertaining foot fights where they would grab each other's feet and push and pull at each other until one of the birds fell off the perch they were on. So I'll just read a short section that describes an intriguing interaction between our two male crows, Kehau and Malama, who were brothers. 5 days into my work with the ala-la, I set out on a gray morning to follow Kehau and Malama, but I felt under the weather. To my surprise, it quickly became apparent that Malama felt that way too. As the other crows busily hopped along branches, poking their bills under bark and into ohia blossoms, Malama rested, perching quietly and preening sporadically. Fortunately, the other ala-la stayed nearby, moving from tree to tree as they foraged. Upon completing yet another behavioral scan, I noted with growing concern that I had recorded Malama sleeping several times, a highly unusual morning behavior. Kehau appeared to be as puzzled as I was by his erstwhile companion's actions. Sidling up to Malama, he made soft mewing calls, then gently preened his sibling's head and neck and delicately nibbled his face. When his ministrations failed to arouse the subdued bird, Kehau plucked an unopened koa flower bud, part of a berry-like cluster that would open into a creamy white powder puff blossom, and pushed it carefully into Malama's back feathers with his bill. No response. Kehau cocked his head, watching Malama, then stretched out his neck, plucked another globular koa bud, and again stashed it, with cautious deliberation, into Malama's plumage. Still no response. Kehau repeated the process again, and still Malama failed to react. Tilting his head, Kehau looked at Malama, murmuring quietly to him. Finally, Malama fluffed out his body feathers and shook them, a comfort behavior known as rousing that often follows a bout of preening, and dislodged the buds, but he remained on his perch, staring at the ground. Malama had in fact contracted avian malaria, but we were able to get him medical help and treated him for the disease. Perhaps my favorite thing about the alala was the bird's extraordinary voice. The crow has more than 60 different types of calls, and to me, it's truly the voice of the Hawaiian cloud forest. Today, despite years of conservation efforts, the Big Island's forests are silent, and there are no wild crows on the island. Fortunately, though, in late 2024, 5 alala were reintroduced to the wild on the island of Maui, where the Hawaiian hawk, which killed a surprising number of reintroduced birds, reintroduced crows, doesn't occur. This reintroduction, which is outside the crow's historical range, is now considered one of the last best hopes for the species. In addition, an experimental biocontrol is being used to try to reduce mosquito numbers. So heartbreaking as the alala's story is, there's still hope for this captivating bird, and I hope that people will read about it and come to care about it, since the crow's future now depends entirely on us. The California Condor story is much better known. This is the third species that I write about in Feather Trails. The condor is a member of the New World vulture family, and it's the largest land bird in North America with a wingspan of about 9.5 feet. And you can really appreciate how big they are when you see them flying next to a raven. During the Pleistocene, more than 10,000 years ago, California condors ranged from British Columbia down to Mexico and as far east as Florida and New York State. Their range eventually contracted westward with the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna, which included large animals like Columbian mammoths and these bizarre-looking giant ground sloths that I've pictured on this slide. By the 1900s, condors were largely restricted to California. This was their core range in Southern California until the 1980s. But scattered reports also exist of condors occurring outside of California until the 1920s. One of the areas where condors also occurred was the Grand Canyon region. Condors were abundant in this area in the Pleistocene. A lot of the caves in Grand Canyon contain Pleistocene-age condor bones. And they also occurred in Arizona in historical times. The last sighting of a condor in Arizona was just south of the Grand Canyon in Williams, Arizona in 1924. Condors declined precipitously during the 1800s and 1900s, reaching a shocking population low point of only 22 condors in 1982. The birds had been disappearing for decades, and biologists really weren't sure why. They knew that many condors were shot, and also many others were killed indirectly when they fed on poisoned carcasses that had been put out to kill predators. But it wasn't until biologists started radio tracking condors in the 1980s that they found birds that had died of lead poisoning after ingesting lead ammunition fragments found in carcasses that they'd fed on. When lead bullets are shot into an animal, they fragment into tiny particles, which are then often consumed by whatever feeds on that animal. It wasn't until years after the first lead poison condor was discovered in 1984 that biologists really began to appreciate the severity of this threat to condors. Meanwhile, in the 1980s, condors were disappearing fast. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided to capture the last few condors that remained in the wild, to bring them into captivity, to keep them safe, and bolster a captive breeding program. The last wild California condor, known as AC9 for adult condor number 9, was captured and brought into captivity in 1987. And this was a really controversial event at the time. It literally tore apart the conservation community. And it was heartbreaking for many people because it meant that for the first time in tens of thousands of years, no condors flew over North America. And there's no guarantee that they ever would again. Fortunately, though, captive breeding, which was initiated in 1982, was very successful. And the first reintroductions of condors, captive reared condors, began in California in 1992. This is a photo of the first two condors that were released to the wild. And then in Arizona at the Vermilion Cliffs, which are just north of Grand Canyon, in 1996. I joined the Condor Recovery Program as the field manager for the Arizona reintroduction effort in 2000. My job was to release condors to the wild, to monitor them with my field crew, and do everything I could to keep the birds safe. This is the flight pen where we held condors on top of the Vermilion Cliffs before their release. And this is the smaller release pen that was right on the rim of the Vermilion Cliffs. We taught newly released condors to roost in places that were safe from predators, like coyotes, and we taught them to stay away from people by harassing them if they perched in inappropriate places, like on a roof looking into a window, for example. Working with condors was a delight. The birds are gregarious, intelligent, and very, very playful. So I'll just read two excerpts that might show you a different side of this enormous vulture than some of you might expect. In the meantime, though, when transmitter signals indicated that a large group of condors was clustered together, I invariably looked for a carcass or a source of entertainment. After locating 11 condors on the Badger Canyon beach, I quickly surveyed the scene and breathed a sigh of relief when I saw no people, no boats, and no tents. Binoculars glued to my eyes, I sat back to enjoy the show. Two condors played tug of war with a branch that had washed ashore. Others walked up and down a drift log, jostling for prime positions. Several paddled in an eddy at the river's edge, then sent water flying skyward as they bathed. Suddenly, Condor 196 emerged from a mid-beach condor scrum, holding an irresistible prize aloft in her bill, a plastic 1-gallon jug. She took off at a run, the other condors in hot pursuit, but with a sudden smack, 196 ran face first into a boulder. Momentarily stunned, she sat back on her legs, still holding the jug that had obscured her view. Regaining her balance, 196 scrambled to her feet and ran on as the other condors closed in. Minutes later, 1-year-old Condor 227 commandeered the jug and flung it skyward with his bill. When it landed unexpectedly on his back, 227 leaped in mock fright and turned on his attacker. Seeming captivated by this new twist on the game, 227 again flung the opaque monster skyward, whereupon it fell back down and again landed on his back. Unnoticed on my distant clifftop perch, I laughed out loud, as captivated by the condor's activities as the birds were by their frenzied play. And this next excerpt gives an insight into how intelligent condors are. The condor's notable but unsung intelligence was underscored for me one evening when biologist Chris Leitner returned to the field house and described Condor 127's solo play with an empty plastic bottle on the Badger Beach. Exhibiting World Cup dexterity, 127 repeatedly punted the bottle down the beach with her bill and chased after it. As she pursued it, the bottle moved closer and closer to the river's edge until the water suddenly caught it and whisked it downstream. In vain, 127 ran along the shoreline, eyes fixed on the bobbing bottle. Just when it seemed lost to her, the current swept the bottle into an eddy several feet from the riverbank. Without hesitation, 127 waded into the water and reached out to retrieve her toy, but it floated just out of reach. Looking around, 127 spotted a partially submerged boulder beyond the bottle. Extending her wings, she hopped out onto the boulder. Now, by stretching her neck, she could just reach the bottle. Nudging it with her beak, she gave it a push shoreward. As it floated toward the beach, she hopped into the water and gave it another nudge, and then another. As the bottle touched solid ground, 127 resumed her frenzied play, punting it down the beach. I know it's anthropomorphizing, Chris remarked, but 127 seemed crushed when she lost her bottle, and she seemed so excited when she was able to retrieve it and could play with it again. As entertained as I was by Chris's story, I was equally struck by 127's intelligence. No level of rote trial by error learning had enabled 127 to retrieve her toy. Instead, she had engaged in multiple steps to enact an outcome that she had envisioned, figuring out how to reach the bottle, then pushing her prize shoreward and counterintuitively away from her, step by careful step, so she could gain control of it again. On a more somber note, the most critical aspect of my job was keeping condors alive, since they were at constant risk from ingesting lead ammunition in the carcasses that they found. Lead ammunition is the single greatest threat to condors. And to be clear, this is not a hunting issue. Hunting benefits condors because it provides them with carrion. Instead, it's solely an ammunition issue. If it weren't for lead ammunition, condors would be thriving. The black and white specks in these x-rays of shot animals are lead fragments. And so you can see how animals that feed on carcasses like these could ingest small particles of lead, which are enough to poison them. If we suspected that condors had fed on a carcass containing lead ammunition, we recaptured them, tested their blood for lead, and then treated them for lead poisoning if necessary. The treatment is known as chelation therapy, and it involves injecting condors twice a day for 5 days with a substance that binds the lead and removes it from the body. In some years, nearly all of the condors in Arizona were exposed to lead, and most required chelation. One condor in California had lead poisoning 13 times, which means that it received at least 130 chelation injections. Each time that bird had to be netted and handled and injected, and so it's incredibly stressful for the birds and the handlers. And although chelation saves a lot of condors, roughly two-thirds of the reintroduced birds were the two-thirds of the deaths of reintroduced birds were caused by lead poisoning. Other scavengers like eagles and ravens are also poisoned by ingesting lead ammunition. In a long-term eagle study in 38 states, nearly half of bald and golden eagles had chronic lead poisoning. So what about people who eat hunter-killed game meat? Are they vulnerable too? To investigate this, a North Dakota doctor x-rayed 100 packages of venison that had been donated to local food banks by hunters in 2007. 59% of the packages that he x-rayed contained visible lead fragments. And this is a photo of some of those packages. Each of these little white flecks is a piece of lead. And yet, despite these findings and similar findings in other states, both years ago and recently, there was a recent study in New York State that found similar levels of lead. Food bank donations by hunters are still unregulated, and hunters are still eating lead-filled meat and feeding it to their families, including to pregnant wives and young children who are especially vulnerable. This lead consumption by those who rely on feed banks, along with hunters and their families, could be having profoundly negative health and societal outcomes. Scores of medical doctors and public health experts have warned us about the dangers of lead ammunition to human health and called for the use of non-lead bullets, which are now widely available. No level of lead is safe for people. Despite that, though, hunter advocacy groups like the NRA say there's no cause for concern. We've been hunting with lead bullets for years and no one's ever been harmed by them. But the effects of lead can be subtle and they're often attributed to other causes. For example, in adults, chronic lead effects include high blood pressure, decreased kidney function, and a variety of reproductive issues. Lead exposure can increase the risk of cancer, and it may be related to cognitive decline and dementia in older adults. In children, lead can lower IQ levels and lead to a higher frequency of delinquent and aggressive behavior. Early lead exposure has also been linked to later criminal behavior. A number of studies attribute the widespread decline in violent crime in the 1990s to the phasing out of leaded gasoline in prior decades. Kids that grew up without being exposed to lead exhaust were less likely to commit crimes. but we still don't know the extent to which lead ammunition might be contributing to the violence and the extremism that we see in the US today. And I think that that deserves serious investigation. We're very good at ignoring warnings that things in our environment are dangerous. We've known that lead bullets are poisoning condors since the 1980s, and it's hard to imagine ignoring a bigger canary in the coal mine, but that's what we've been doing. Fortunately, though, things are starting to change. For the sake of condors, California banned lead ammunition in 2019, which is a great start. But no other state has done that. And it's remarkable to me how rarely we hear about the human health impacts of lead ammunition. Despite the perils of lead, though, I had many great moments while working with condors, and I write about them extensively in this book, including documenting the first egg laid in the wild by a reintroduced condor. News of Condor 119's famous egg was broadcast all over the country, even the world actually, and Discover magazine listed it in their top 100 science stories of 2001. I also had the good fortune of monitoring Arizona's first condor chick. Condor 305 had the chance to be the first nestling raised by reintroduced condors to fledge successfully in the wild. And I won't spoil the book by letting you know if this historic fledging happened, but I will say that it was an incredible roller coaster getting to this point in Arizona, and events were even more challenging in California. Despite the existential threat that lead ammunition poses to condors, reintroductions and intensive management have significantly bolstered the condor population since its low point of 22 birds. Condors are now reproducing successfully in the wild, and they're recapturing more and more of their former range. Thanks to the Endangered Species Act and thousands of dedicated volunteers, people, not necessarily volunteering, these three magnificent species are still with us today. The peregrine falcon is one of our biggest conservation success stories. It taught us that the best way to recover a species is to eliminate its main threat. In the case of peregrines, that was the pesticide DDT. Not eliminating the main threat to a species undermines its recovery, as we've seen with the California condor, which survives only because of intensive management. But if we can replace lead ammunition with non-lead substitutes, we'll be able to save the condor as well. The Hawaiian crow faces multiple complex threats, which makes its recovery more challenging. And on top of that, funding and recovery efforts were delayed for many decades until it was almost too late. But the peregrine and other birds have shown us that targeted conservation efforts really do work. We've had tremendous success recovering endangered species, but along the way, we've also come to appreciate that our best conservation strategy is to prevent them from becoming endangered in the first place. And I think that's where bird lovers like us can come in. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, there are about 96 million of us who watch and enjoy birds in the U.S. And if we all do a few small things to help them, we might be able to turn around declining bird numbers. For example, we can keep our cats indoors. As I'm sure you all know, this is probably the best thing that we can do to help birds. And it helps keep us safe from toxoplasmosis, too. We can put decals on our windows to prevent bird collisions, avoid using pesticides, grow native plants like the ones some people want today, and foster habitats around our homes, use non-lead ammunition when we hunt, and support our public lands and bird conservation organizations, just to name a few ideas. There are countless other ways that we can help birds, and I often provide additional suggestions when I write about birds. So those miners who use canaries in the coal mine to alert them to bad air, well, many of them became attached to those birds. So when the canaries struggled for air, the miners revived them with an oxygen tank, which I think is a perfect metaphor for bird conservation efforts. Conservationist Thomas Lovejoy said, if you take care of birds, you take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. By helping birds, we not only enrich our own lives by supporting the bird life around us, but we also end up solving a variety of environmental problems that helps other creatures on our planet too, including us. So thanks to you all for listening, and thanks for all you're doing and your chapter's doing to help birds. Feather Trails is available online and in bookstores. And as was mentioned in the beginning, the American Birding Association chose Feather Trails as their favorite bird book of 2024. So please consider getting a copy if you haven't already, so I can continue to share my conservation messages and help birds. And finally, you can also find more of my writings online. I write a blog on the Substack platform called Words for Birds. So I'm happy to take questions. I threw an awful lot of information at you in a very short time.
Questions online?
Any questions?
Tammy has one.
Oh,
Okay, this might be kind of a depressing question, but I was wondering, I do a lot of like genetic work with birds, and how do you know, did you guys think about effective population size when you were reintroducing birds? And if so, how did you ensure that there was like enough differences in the reintroduced birds?
I'm not sure if I caught all that. Can you repeat the very beginning of it? Were you asking about potential genetic inbreeding of these rare birds in small populations?
Yeah, I was wondering with reintroduced populations, since they usually have a really small effective population size, how can they like be robust against diseases and different things like that? How can we account for that when we're doing reintroductions?
It's really it's funny. It's very variable. Um, in the condors, even though there were only 22 birds left, they represented a pretty wide geographic area and three sort of different what geneticists ended up calling clans. And so they had a pretty robust genetic diversity for that small population. In all of these recovery efforts, you have teams of geneticists that are looking at the genetics of the birds that are left and making pairings that maximize genetic diversity. So condors overall were pretty genetically diverse, and there were far fewer inbreeding problems than people were concerned there might be. There was one deleterious gene that caused some problems with certain eggs, but overall, condors were pretty robust from a genetic standpoint, and so they did fine. The Hawaiian crow was a different situation where the genetic diversity was really limited, and they had a really hard time breeding the birds successfully in captivity. So, like in some years, they might produce a pretty significant number of eggs, but only a tiny fraction of those eggs would actually hatch. And so it took a much longer time to build up the Hawaiian crow population. And there was a lot more concern, and still is, I think, about the genetic diversity of those birds. But always there's a team of biologists, geneticists, a stud book that they manage to maximize the pairings of these endangered birds so that they get the most robust population possible with their limited start.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Does that help?
Yes, yeah, I used to work on the Sea Hick project, which is like a Guam kingfisher, and we had a lot of issues with not having enough genetic diversity, so they're still like not doing well. But
I think it's a lot harder with island populations, because they have kind of limited genetic diversity on islands as it is. So I think those species are a lot more challenging for so many reasons. But thanks for your work and doing what you could for them.
thank you.
Questions online?
Now, just somebody online did thank you. She said, it was your presentation was heartbreaking and hopeful.
Right.
She's buying your book.
And I hope my book, it has heartbreaking moments, but hopefully it also has funny moments, and it leaves us very hopeful. I mean, these birds have had, an amazing turnaround, all of them. So
Yeah,
our efforts can really make a difference.
Yes,
In terms of like, I guess reintroduction on the peregrine, what's the choice between using the methods that the scientists use versus like falconry where they're training their birds to hunt and they give them those increased odds at release?
I think they kind of found that the best, most successful way of reintroducing peregrines was kind of a combination of those methods. They ended up using methods that falconers had used, for years, where they would raise birds on a site and then put food out for them the way we did until the birds were ready to disperse and be on their own and learn to hunt. Part of the reason they don't want to train the birds off people's hands is they want they want the birds to not have a relationship with people, to be truly wild, and so they use some of the falconers methodologies for raising birds and letting them be in the wild, without sort of the falconry component of taming them down and allowing them to hunt for their handler. So it's a bit of a combination. Falconers did play an instrumental role in the peregrine recovery in developing some of those techniques, and helping biologists do that. But they definitely didn't want the birds to all be, have relationships with people.
Is that also specific to the captive bred birds versus like when they pull them and training those behaviors?
As far as I know, when they were raising them in captivity, they did not treat them the way falconers treat birds. They didn't interact with them. They had them, in areas where they minimized their interaction with people, in the aviaries where they were holding them and breeding them. So they didn't treat them the way falconers treat birds.
Thanks.
any other questions?
I probably have more details about it in my book and can explain it better there.
Okay.
And you can all see at the bottom, if you use that code at the checkout, it's 35% off from Chelsea Green Publishing to buy her book. And otherwise, check out, and I will post, I'll do a screen print if I get, no, I can't do a screen print. If you could just do a screen print of that page, send it to me, I can put it on our website. That lists your blog, your website, your email,
Mhm.
and well, at least your blog and your website. I won't put your email.
Right. I think if you Google my name and put in Feather Trails, you should, or just put in my name. I think my website and blog should come up. They come up usually pretty quickly.
Oh, I got a good picture copy of your Feather Trails book that I use in my announcement page.
Oh, right.
I pirated it. No, it's called screen printing. Completely legal.
Well, I'm
There-
happy to use it to promote this book, so thank you.
A lot of people are commenting that they like your presentation.
These are online.
These are
Zoom
online content,
audience.
and you probably are seeing them on your end too, if you've.
Oh, no, I hadn't seen them. Thank you.
Barry Breyer did point out something that we've all noticed here in our immediate area, how the bald eagles have come back.
Yes.
And he's noticing the brown pelicans down on the Texas coast. So
It is really encouraging. I mean, we've worked hard to bring back some of these species, and a lot of the techniques that were developed with peregrines, they ended up using for bald eagles. So it has been a huge turnaround.
Yeah, this is Chuck Baskin. I grew up in Corpus Christi on the Texas coast, and
Mm.
we didn't have brown pelicans in the 50s. I don't remember them really.
Mhm.
My mother was an avid bird watcher, and she was so excited. It's probably into the mid-late 80s that the pelicans, the brown pelicans, started becoming more common around the bay. And she
Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, they were one of the species that was really hard hit by DDT. I mean, the peregrine is sort of the cover bird for that story, and also the bald eagles, but ospreys and brown pelicans and other fish-eating birds got hit really hard too. So,
Okay.
Well,
Well,
thank you all.
We really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks,
Good
everybody.
night. Thank you.